You've decided you want to make a bamboo fly rod, and you've decided which rod you want to make. Now it's time to decide which culm of bamboo that fly rod is going to come from. Now there's one more decision you want to make before you get into this process, and that is whether or not you want to flame your rod, because a flamed rod can hide or even enhance some of what otherwise would be cosmetic flaws in the bamboo. So if you're making a rod that's not flamed, you have to work around those things or try to get a culm that doesn't have much of them at all so that it's easy to work around those things. Now, maybe this decision for you of which culm of bamboo to use is easily made because you only have one culm of bamboo. That's fine. This process will still show you some things that you really want to avoid, as well as maybe inform whether or not you want to flame your rod. Now, for this rod that I'm building for the YouTube series, I'm not going to flame the rod. So with that in mind, let's take this stack of bamboo out back and I'll show you what I look for. When selecting a culm, it is helpful to have some 150 grit sandpaper, a sanding block, and dial or digital calipers. I should also note that I'm assuming you are using Arundinaria amabilis, also known as Tonkin bamboo. This is currently accepted as the best bamboo species for making fly rods. We will be looking for a few things as we go along. First, we want to make sure that the culm has a power fiber depth and density that is appropriate for the rod we are making. The dark ring along the outside of this culm is the section of power fibers I'm referring to, and we want as much of that dark ring in the finished rod as possible. We can measure this ring with our calipers. Most bamboo you get should be sufficient for a lighter rod like we are making, but there may be exceptions. If you're making a larger rod, you'll need to pay attention more closely. Next, we will be looking for damage on the culm, as well as leaf nodes or other physically undesirable elements. These are a no-go. You simply can't use them in a rod, so you'll need to work around them. Finally, we will look at the cosmetics of the culm. These will be the elements that you may or may not want to visually show up in the finished product, but these won't affect the structural integrity of the rod. The culms I have were already cut in half for shipping. I don't prefer this because it limits my options, but it certainly isn't a deal breaker. Also note that I weighed and marked these culms when I received them. This can potentially help identify culms with more or denser power fibers, but it's extremely relative. If we look closely at the butt end of this larger culm, which is on the left, we can see the power fibers are a little more densely packed and go slightly deeper into the pith than the culm on the right. I probably don't want to use this culm for my 7.5 foot 4 weight. Why is that? Well, since my largest finished rod diameter will be just under 0.310 inches, I only need the power fiber depth at the butt end to be half of that, about 0.155 inches. And while I like to have a little extra, my calipers tell me the smaller culm in this photo will be just fine. Don't sweat having extra power fibers too much. It's simply that while the extra power fibers won't hurt, anything beyond what you need could be used on a larger rod. I'm going to remove this culm from contention unless I don't find a better candidate. It might be a good one to get larger rods out of. I'm a little worried about the lightest culm. It is smaller in diameter, which often means it'll have fewer flaws, but to get a better look at the power fibers, I use my sanding block and 150 grit to lightly sand the end of the culm. I see that the depth of power fibers looks quite small, but by using my calipers I find it is still larger than half the tip dimension, so I might be okay. Since the culm is already cut in half, I can gather more information by looking at the power fiber depth midway up the culm and comparing it to my rod dimensions at the ferrule, which will be halfway up the finished rod. Uh-oh, I don't like what I see here. I'm not getting much depth of power fiber, and it looks like I'd be into the pith for my finished rod. This culm is not going to be very good except for very small rods. Next! The remaining 3 culms are fine candidates from a power fiber perspective. Let's look at them for deep scratches, leaf nodes, and other structural flaws. This one has a big gouge right in the middle of the butt half of the culm. That's super inconvenient and will be about the width of 3 or 4 strips that I simply cannot use on this rod. Not a deal breaker, but disappointing. Be on the lookout for scratches that go down into the power fibers. Scratches that are on the surface enamel are okay, but anything that digs down to the point where you see lines is a no-go. This one has a few leaf nodes in the butt section, but they're all pretty well aligned, so I should only lose a couple of strips because of them. A couple of the culms have a few little bumps on them, which likely are from insects feeding on the bamboo when it was growing. These cannot be in a finished rod, and no matter what, I'll need to be on the lookout for internal insect damage as I split and plane the bamboo. Be mindful that you can often work around these things. Just because there's a deep scratch at one end of the culm doesn't mean you can't use the whole culm. Okay, while some of this is not great, so far these 3 culms would still be usable if I work around those flaws. Let's move on to cosmetics. This is where things can get tricky for an unflamed rod, but don't worry too much. This is just an aesthetic choice, and nothing here will affect the structural integrity of your rod. Again, remember that you can work around some of these flaws as well. As an example, here's a butt section with a lot of surface marking, but none of it is structurally detrimental, and all of it will be under the grip of the finished rod, never to be seen again. After looking at different cosmetic blemishes and considering where my strips might come from in the butt and tip sections, I come back to that culm with the big gash. I only need 6 good strips from that section of bamboo, so I should be just fine using this culm. Finally, the other 2 culms have some markings I think could look really nice in a flamed rod, so I'm going to save those for later. So I think this is the one. Our culm is selected, and I can already start to envision the fish I might catch on this rod. The next step is going to be splitting the bamboo into strips. And so if you want to be notified when I upload that video, please subscribe to the channel, hit that bell notification icon. And if this has been a helpful video, hit the like button. I'll see you around the next bend, and until then, tight glue lines. I think that's probably good, but one more for funsies.